Hey guys, tonight we slip on a pair of stiff-issue boots, sling a dented mess tin under one arm, and shuffle into the long, echoing line of a World War II mess hall. The air smells faintly of boiled something, potatoes, cabbage, or maybe socks. You're not quite sure yet. Steam drifts from enormous cauldrons, and somewhere, a sergeant is shouting about keeping the line moving. This is boot camp breakfast, and you're about to learn how the military approached the impossible challenge of feeding hundreds of thousands of young recruits every single morning. Spoiler, it wasn't always pretty, but it kept you standing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I want to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've been up since before dawn. Boot camp has no interest in your sleep schedule. The barracks reek of wool blankets and polish. The floorboards chill your bare feet before you manage to pull on those heavy socks. Outside, the parade ground is still dark, lit only by a faint gray line along the horizon. And here you are, standing in line, mess kit in hand, trying not to think about the rumors you've heard. If the eggs don't get you, the coffee will. Breakfast in the military had one simple rule: fast and functional. It had to fuel you for grueling drills, long marches, and the occasional surprise inspection. In the 1940s, the U.S. Army relied heavily on standard-issue staples: oatmeal thick enough to stand a spoon in, scrambled eggs that had never seen a chicken, more on that later, and toast from bread baked in bulk somewhere far away. The British Army, meanwhile, leaned on tea, porridge, and bread slathered with a thin scrape of margarine. Nothing fancy. This was about calories, not comfort. The sheer logistics of feeding boot camp recruits were staggering. Picture massive steel vats big enough to hide in, filled with oatmeal or beans, stirred by soldiers wielding paddles the size of canoe oars. Historians still argue whether these mass meals were more about efficiency or about teaching you, from the start, that your individual tastes didn't matter here. And then there were the quirks. Every unit had its own little culinary folklore. Some swore the scrambled eggs were powdered, dyed, and served with enough grease to make them slide right off the plate if you tilted it. Others joked that the bacon was cut so thin you could read the daily orders through it. The cooks weren't trying to win awards. They were following orders themselves, working from Army quartermaster manuals that calculated exactly how many grams of protein, carbs, and fat you needed per day. The coffee, if you could call it that, was an entire conversation on its own. Instant coffee had been embraced by the military because it was quick, shelf-stable, and didn't require a percolator for hundreds. Unfortunately, it tasted a bit like burnt cardboard steeped in bitterness. Recruits learned fast: either you drowned it in sugar and evaporated milk from a can, or you chugged it in one go and tried not to think about it. The British recruits, of course, looked on in mild horror, clutching their tea mugs like lifelines. You'd get your tray, sometimes metal, sometimes enamelware, and shuffle past the serving line. Next, barked a corporal, ladling oatmeal into one section. Another clanged a spoonful of eggs into another compartment, and finally, maybe a pale sausage or two. A slice of bread topped with a wedge of that mysterious government cheese rounded out the meal. It was all hot, filling, and in theory, exactly what your body needed to withstand the day's punishment. There were small victories. On rare days, if the supply trucks had been generous, you might get a dollop of jam. If you happened to be stationed near a dairy-producing area, the milk might actually be fresh. And every so often, a cook might sneak in a seasoning shake or two, trying to bring a hint of real flavor into the monotony. The atmosphere in the mess hall was its own part of the experience. You learned to eat fast, not because anyone told you to, but because the second you sat down, a drill instructor might come through bellowing about how you had exactly 5 minutes before the next drill. Conversations were short, often revolving around whether today's oatmeal was thicker or thinner than yesterday's. And of course, there were the endless pranks. Switching sugar for salt was a classic, though risky, as the cook's staff could retaliate. Boot camp meals weren't just about feeding you, they were about breaking you in. Learning to accept whatever was put in front of you was part of military life. You couldn't be picky when the stakes were higher than just taste. And oddly enough, you'd remember these breakfasts years later, not for their flavor, but for the ritual. The clang of the ladle against your tray. The steam rising from vats of oatmeal. The constant hum of boots, trays, and shouted orders. Every soldier had a story. One guy might swear he once found a whole bay leaf in his porridge and thought it was some exotic gift from the cooks. Another might insist he could tell the difference between Monday bacon and Friday bacon just by the smell. And then there were the debates. Historians still argue whether the infamous boot camp belly was from bad cooking, rapid dietary changes, or just nerves. By the time you'd finish your meal, the mess hall would already be clearing out, boots pounding against the floor as recruits hurried to the next ordeal. You'd stack your tray, rinse it in a basin of lukewarm water, and step back into the cool morning air with the faint taste of instant coffee lingering on your tongue. Ahead of you lay a day of sweat, shouting, and sore muscles, but at least you weren't doing it on an empty stomach. And somewhere, in the steam and clatter, you'd start to realize that this shared, unglamorous, oddly comforting breakfast was as much a part of becoming a soldier as the drills, the uniforms, and the salutes. It was the first bite of a whole new life, served up on a dented tray. Out in the field, breakfast feels like a distant luxury. You've traded the mess hall's steaming vats and chip trays for a damp patch of earth, a helmet full of cold rainwater, and something in a brown wax box labeled simply C-ration. It's not pretty, but it's your lifeline. Soldiers in World War II carried these field rations into combat zones, packed with the bare essentials needed to keep you alive when fresh food was out of reach. You rip open the cardboard sleeve, fingers stiff from the chill, and pull out 3 squat tin cans. They rattle against each other like coins in an unlucky gambler's pocket. Inside one, you might find beans and franks, thick, orange, and clinging together like they're afraid of the weather. Another could hold chopped ham and eggs, a texture that's hard to describe without comparing it to something unmentionable. The third is a B-unit, which sounds vaguely like a spy code name but is really just crackers, powdered drink mix, and a small square of something optimistically called candy. The appeal of C-rations wasn't taste, it was shelf life. Each set had to survive months of storage, endure rattling around in your pack, and still be edible after a week in the mud. Historians still argue whether they were more about calories than morale. You quickly learn the truth, they're about calories. Lots of them. Beans, meat, sugar, and fat in a ratio designed to keep you moving when moving is the only option. The can opener is its own tiny saga. Known as AP-38, it's a thumb-sized scrap of folded steel that could open your rations, tighten a screw, or, if you're feeling ambitious, serve as an improvised weapon. Every soldier carried one on a keyring or hung from a chain, and losing it was a small disaster. You wedge it into the can's lip, twist, and feel that gritty resistance as you cut through decades of tin can engineering. Steam rises from the beans, lukewarm if you're lucky, cold if you're not. Heating them requires a bit of improvisation. Maybe you build a tiny fire shielded by your helmet, or balance the can near a vehicle's engine block. One unlucky guy once tried to heat his rations by sticking the can in the exhaust pipe of a truck. It worked, right up until the can exploded. The smell lingered for days. Some soldiers swore by mixing and matching components, crackers dipped into the beans, or the chocolate bar crumbled into hot water to make a drink. Others treated the tins like trade goods, swapping their least favorites with comrades. The guy who loved meat and vegetable hash was a rare and valuable ally. And then there was the eternal joke about mystery meat. No matter how many times you read the label, it never truly explained what was inside. Chopped ham and eggs? maybe. Or maybe something that once dreamed of being ham. One Marine in the Pacific once carved the outline of a pig into his hash just to give it a sense of identity. The sea rations also came with cigarettes in the early years, a small, crinkly pack of 3 tucked in with matches. They were meant as a morale boost, though non-smokers often used them for bartering. One cigarette might buy you an extra chocolate bar, or if you were desperate, half a can of someone's peaches. Speaking of peaches, finding fruit in your ration was like striking gold. The syrupy sweetness was a reminder of the world beyond the mud and gunpowder. Guys would hoard the cans for weeks, saving them for a quiet moment, or for leverage in a good trade. There are stories of men swapping their entire meal for a single can of peaches, eating them slowly with a fork to stretch the taste as far as possible. It wasn't just Americans. The British had their own field tins, the infamous Compo rations, which included tea, biscuits, and tinned meat nicknamed bully beef. Australians got tins of jam that could double as roof tar in an emergency. Germans issued Eisenportion, iron rations, compact, high-calorie packs meant to be eaten only on direct orders, though in practice hunger often overruled regulations. Sea rations had a psychological side. Opening one was a reminder that you were still supplied, still connected to the vast machinery of war logistics. Even if the contents were bland, the fact they'd reached you at all was a small miracle. Soldiers in the Ardennes during the Battle of the Bulge spoke of eating them in frozen foxholes, the metal cans sticking to their fingers in the cold, yet finding comfort in that mechanical click of the opener. Of course, there were debates. Historians still argue whether soldiers' complaints about sea rations were exaggerated. Some claimed you could get used to them after a few months. Others insisted that anyone who said that had lost all sense of taste. The truth? Probably somewhere in between. You finish your meal quickly. Not because you love it, but because lingering too long invites cold, rain, and worse. The tins clatter into a garbage pit dug behind camp, and you wipe your hands on your trousers, knowing the faint smell of beans will probably stick with you for days. Your belly is full enough to get you through the next march, but you're already thinking about your next ration, and whether it will be something you can actually enjoy, or just another exercise in swallowing without chewing too much. The last thing you notice as you shoulder your pack is the sound of someone behind you humming. You recognize the tune. It's an old diner jingle from before the war. Funny thing about sea rations, no matter how far from home you are, they have a way of making you think about the meals you'd give anything to have again. Marching changes your relationship with food in ways you don't expect. When you're on the move, every ounce in your pack matters, and every calorie you swallow has to carry its weight. That's where the K-ration comes in, a compact, calorie-dense box designed not for comfort, but for portability. It's the grab-and-go meal of World War II, except instead of a neatly wrapped sandwich and a soda, you get crackers, meat paste, and a powdered drink that tastes faintly like citrus if you close your eyes. The K-ration was originally developed in 1942 for paratroopers and light infantry, troops expected to travel light and fight hard. Dr. Ansel Keys, the nutritionist who created it, supposedly tested the prototype by handing it to soldiers on a training exercise and asking, "Could you live on this for a few days?" They could, but they didn't love it. Historians still argue whether the K-ration was ever meant for long-term use, or if desperate wartime supply lines just stretched its mission past the breaking point. The whole thing came in a small, waxed cardboard box that fit easily into a pocket. There were 3 versions: breakfast, dinner, and supper, though the naming was more about spreading out calories than delivering a real meal experience. You might open your breakfast K-ration to find canned chopped ham and eggs, dry and salty, a small packet of biscuits, a fruit bar or canned fruit, powdered coffee, sugar, and, if luck smiled, a small packet of gum. Dinner might bring cheese spread, a chocolate bar, and lemonade powder. Supper could be meat and vegetable hash, biscuits, and some tropical chocolate that tasted vaguely like soap. You learn quickly that the biscuits aren't like anything from home. They're dense, dry, and engineered to last for months in any climate. Biting into one sometimes feels like an endurance test. The cheese spread, often referred to by soldiers as cheese in a can without the can, was both loved and hated. It was spreadable, salty, and could mask the flavor of almost anything else, which made it valuable for those who couldn't stomach the meat tins. Then there was the derationed chocolate bar, or its cousin, the tropical bar. Designed to resist melting in high heat, it also resisted the human desire to eat it. Dense and slightly waxy, it was meant more as emergency fuel than dessert. One soldier joked that eating it was like chewing on a block of brown chalk, only chalk might have been easier on the teeth. Still, in the middle of a long march, a bite of that bitter chocolate could give you just enough of a sugar kick to keep moving. K rations also came with tiny luxuries: a few sheets of toilet paper, a wooden spoon, a pack of cigarettes, or a matchbook. The cigarettes, like in C rations, were both a comfort and a currency. Even non-smokers learned to appreciate their value in trades. One cigarette could buy you an extra biscuit. A whole pack might get you the last can of fruit from someone's breakfast box. When you're marching 10, 12, even 15 miles in a day, you start rationing your rations. You might open the box in the morning and only eat half, saving the rest for a midday break. Some soldiers found creative ways to combine parts from different meal types, mixing cheese spread with crushed biscuits and water to make a kind of gritty porridge, or crumbling the chocolate bar into instant coffee for a bittersweet sludge. Out on the move, there's no mess hall to linger in and no fire to cook over. You eat leaning against a tree, sitting in the mud, or perched on a rock with your rifle across your lap. Rain might be dripping down your collar, your boots squelching with every step, and still you'll pull out that box, peel back the waxed paper, and chew mechanically. It's not about savoring, it's about fueling the machine that is you. Every soldier has a favorite component. For some, it's the canned fruit, pineapple, peaches, or pears and syrup that could be sipped straight from the tin. For others, it's the lemonade powder, which transformed plain water into something that tasted almost like summer. And then there were the rare finds. Sometimes, due to packing errors or supply quirks, you'd open a box and find 2 chocolates instead of 1, or an extra pack of gum. Those moments felt like winning the lottery. Of course, not everyone played by the rules. Some men ditched parts of their rations they didn't like, lightening their load, while others hoarded their favorites until they could eat them in a quiet moment. One story tells of a paratrooper who saved the same tin of fruit cocktail for 3 months, only to have it burst open during a jump, soaking his pack and clothes in sticky syrup. He claimed he could still smell it weeks later. Logistically, K rations were a marvel. They packed about 3,000 calories into a day's supply that weighed just over 2 pounds. But they weren't perfect. Long-term reliance could lead to vitamin deficiencies, especially if fresh food was scarce. Historians still argue whether this was due to poor nutritional planning or simply the reality of trying to feed millions across multiple continents. By the end of a long march, you've eaten every crumb, sucked the last bit of syrup from the fruit tin, and tucked the empty wrappers back into the box to avoid leaving a trail. You sling your pack over your sore shoulders, feeling that dull, satisfied heaviness in your stomach. It's not a gourmet meal, but it's enough to keep your legs moving through mud, over hills, and into whatever waits ahead. And in the quiet moments, when the column slows and the sound of boots on dirt blends into the steady rhythm of your breathing, you think about how strange it is, how something so small, so plain, can be the difference between dragging your feet and pushing forward. The K ration isn't just food. Out here, it's momentum in a box. After a while, you stop asking what the meat is supposed to be and start wondering whether it ever had a name at all. This is the mystery meat era, when your meal comes in a can stamped meat chopped, or meat with vegetables, and that's the entirety of its biography. Out here, meat is a texture, a concept, not necessarily an identifiable animal. You learn quickly that the term, mystery meat, isn't just a joke among soldiers, it's a coping mechanism. If you don't dwell on it, you can swallow it without hesitation. Historians still argue whether these vague labels were the result of supply secrecy, ingredient variability, or just an attempt to keep soldiers from asking too many questions. The truth is probably a mix of all three. The classic offender in American rations was meat and vegetable hash, a soft, reddish-brown blend of finely ground meat and potatoes with occasional flecks of carrot. When heated, it gave off a smell somewhere between a school cafeteria and a mechanic's shop. Cold, it had a solid, gelatinous layer of fat on top that could be peeled away like a wax seal. The British bully beef, made from corned beef packed in gelatin, wasn't much better, dense, salty, and prone to turning into a meat brick in cold weather. When you pop open a can, there's always a moment where the contents slide out whole, holding the shape of the tin like some bizarre culinary sculpture. If you're feeling fancy, you might slice it into rounds and fry it in your mess tin over a small fire. If not, you just carve out a chunk with your spoon and try not to think about what part of the cow, or pig, or whatever it might have been. This meat had a purpose beyond feeding you. It traveled well, lasted months without refrigeration, and delivered the fat and protein you needed for long marches or heavy labor. It was cheap to make and easy to ship in bulk. The downside? Flavor and texture weren't exactly priorities. As one soldier put it, "It's like they made meat without the meat part." Still, soldiers got creative. Mix hash with mashed biscuits and a little water, and you could make a sort of dumpling. Add some hot sauce, if you'd been lucky enough to trade for a bottle, and the whole thing became almost enjoyable. A few resourceful cooks in the field even made mystery meat stew, combining whatever vegetables they could scrounge with the canned meat and letting it simmer into something vaguely comforting. Then there were the pranks. One unit kept a can of particularly rubbery hash as a kind of mascot, passing it around on special occasions. Another group once served their mystery meat cold to a visiting officer, garnished with a sprig of wild parsley they'd found near camp, just to see if he'd notice. He didn't. The Germans had their own take on mystery meat, tins of Fleischkonserve, often pork-based, that could be fried, eaten cold, or spread on bread. The Japanese military issued canned fish and meat products with equally vague descriptions. In every army, soldiers eventually developed nicknames for their least favorite tins. Dog food, roof patch, meat surprise. There was also a psychological layer. Eating something you couldn't identify was part of adapting to military life. Accepting that control over your food was a luxury you didn't have. You stopped thinking about preferences and started thinking about energy. You learned to judge food by how it felt in your stomach after a march, not by how it tasted going down. Sometimes, mystery meat wasn't even meat at all. Supply shortages could lead to filler-heavy recipes, where soy or other plant proteins were mixed in to stretch the real meat. In some cases, this was intentional for cost and nutrition balance. In others, it was simply what could be produced with the materials at hand. Soldiers could usually tell when they were eating fake meat, but most didn't care as long as it kept them moving. The smell, though, that lingered. Frying mystery meat gave off a greasy, metallic aroma that clung to your uniform, your hands, even your hair. Some swore it followed them long after the war, sneaking into memories whenever they opened a can of Spam or corned beef decades later. And yet, nostalgia is a strange thing. Many veterans, when asked about rations, bring up the mystery meat with a mix of disgust and fondness. It was a shared experience, a kind of culinary badge of honor. You didn't have to like it, you just had to eat it, laugh about it later, and keep going. One old story tells of a unit in Italy who, after months of the same tinned meat, were invited by local villagers to a feast. The soldiers braced themselves for more of the same, and were shocked to find fresh roasted pork, vegetables, and bread. They ate until they couldn't move, then quietly pocketed some bread to go with their next can of hash. Because no matter how bad the mystery meat was, you knew it would still be there tomorrow, waiting in the supply truck like an old, unwanted friend. By now, you've learned to approach your ration tin with a kind of stoic respect. You tap the lid with your spoon, pop it open with the P38, and dig in without ceremony. Mystery meat doesn't care about your opinion. It's there to keep you alive, and in its own strange way, it succeeds. By now you've grown accustomed to the clink of tins and the thud of heavy biscuits in your kit, but breakfast, real breakfast, is still a memory you can taste. Then one morning, instead of the usual hash or biscuits, you open your ration crate to find two things that promise a taste of home: powdered eggs and instant coffee. It sounds hopeful, almost indulgent. Eggs for breakfast, coffee to shake off the chill? But the powdered egg is a tricky beast. In the 1940s, the US and British armies embraced dehydrated eggs because they were cheap, light, and could last for months. Mix the powder with water, heat it up, and voila, you had scrambled eggs. At least, that was the theory. In reality, it was more like a yellow, slightly rubbery mass that could range from passably decent to, "What did I do to deserve this?" Historians still argue whether the flavor was ruined by poor storage or just the drying process itself. Some soldiers claimed that if you closed your eyes and pretended hard enough, it was almost like eating fresh eggs. Others would rather skip breakfast entirely. The cooks in base camps did their best. With large enough batches, a hot pan, and a little butter, if they could get it, powdered eggs could be coaxed into something resembling the real thing. Field soldiers, though, usually didn't have that luxury. You might end up with lumps of dried powder hiding in your scramble, or an overcooked rubbery sheet that looked more like a yellow rain poncho than food. The British Army was particularly enthusiastic about powdered eggs during the war. Civilians at home were also issued them through rationing, so soldiers from the UK had already learned the art of managing expectations. One quirk you notice? The British always seemed to make tea first, even if they were about to brew coffee from the American supply crates. Old habits die hard. And then there's the coffee. Instant coffee was a logistical godsend, lightweight, quick to prepare, and easy to distribute in single-serve packets. Unfortunately, it also had all the charm of drinking hot, caffeinated mud. It came as a fine powder or tiny crystals that dissolved instantly in hot water, in theory. In practice, you sometimes ended up with stubborn granules floating like suspicious debris on the surface. If you were lucky enough to be near a proper mess setup, you might get percolated coffee instead, still strong enough to strip paint, but at least recognizably coffee. Out in the field, you'd heat water in your canteen cup, dump in the instant coffee and sugar, give it a stir, and drink it as fast as possible before it cooled into something undrinkable. Soldiers often joked that instant coffee didn't actually wake you up. It just made you too bitter to sleep. Coffee had a place beyond just keeping you alert. It was a social glue. You'd see small knots of soldiers huddled around a mess tin, passing around a cup, chatting quietly in the early hours before orders came down. Even if the taste was terrible, the ritual of holding that warm cup between your hands made the day start a little better. The combination of powdered eggs and coffee became almost iconic in its own way. When you sat down with both, you could almost pretend you were in a diner somewhere back home, almost. The eggs lacked the softness of fresh scramble, the coffee lacked the richness of a good roast. But together they formed a kind of makeshift comfort. And when you were thousands of miles from home, comfort counted for a lot. You'd also see some inventive adaptations. Some soldiers mixed the powdered eggs with milk from condensed cans to get a creamier texture. Others fried the eggs with bits of leftover bacon or corned beef from the day before. In the Pacific, where fresh coconuts were sometimes available, a few daring souls even tried scrambling powdered eggs in coconut milk, a strange but memorable breakfast. And of course, the barter system flourished here too. A man who hated coffee might trade his packet for someone else's chocolate. Someone with an extra sugar ration could sweeten a deal for a second helping of eggs. In a world where you didn't control much, trading food became a small act of agency. There's an unspoken truth that you learn: these breakfasts were never about taste alone. They were about starting the day with something hot, something filling, something to carry you through the drills, the marches, and the waiting. Even a bland breakfast was better than facing the morning on an empty stomach. One veteran once said that the smell of powdered eggs cooking in the morning was the most reliable thing in camp. Rain, mud, orders, they all changed. But the sight of a line of soldiers, trays in hand, waiting for that scoop of yellow, was constant. And for all the jokes and complaints, there's something almost comforting about that kind of routine. When you're done, you scrape the last rubbery bit off your plate, drain the last bitter sip from your cup, and wipe your mouth on your sleeve. The sun's barely up, the air still carries the smell of cooking powder and burnt coffee, and the day ahead is already looming. But your stomach's full, your hands are warm, and in the grand scheme of things, that's enough to start marching. You've heard rumors about it for weeks. The legendary chocolate bar that can survive the desert sun, the jungle heat, and probably a small explosion. Today, you finally pull one from your ration pack, the D ration, or, if you're stationed somewhere hot, the tropical bar. At first glance, it looks promising: solid chocolate in neat squares, the kind of thing that might melt in your mouth and lift your spirits. But then you remember the warnings. This isn't chocolate for pleasure. This is chocolate for war. The D ration was the brainchild of the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps, developed with Hershey's in the late 1930s. The mission was clear: create a high-calorie bar that wouldn't melt in hot climates, wouldn't crumble, and wouldn't be eaten too quickly. The last part wasn't about preserving stock. It was about making sure soldiers used it as emergency food, not as a snack. Historians still argue whether it was deliberately made less tasty to discourage casual eating, but one bite is enough to convince you that, yes, they probably meant it. It's dense. Really dense. You can feel it in your hand. This is not the soft, creamy chocolate from home. The D ration contains cocoa powder, sugar, skim milk powder, oat flour, and enough fat to keep you going for hours. It's molded into a thick block that's almost impossible to bite into without some effort. Many soldiers resorted to shaving off slivers with a knife or melting it slightly in hot water to make a drink. The tropical bar came later, designed for service in the Pacific. Even more heat-resistant, it was almost waxy in texture and had a faint coconut-like note, though not enough to make it pleasant. It could withstand 120 degrees Fahrenheit without melting, a marvel for logistics, a tragedy for your taste buds. Out in the field, you might save your D ration for the moments you really need it: on a long march, in a foxhole with no other food, or after a sudden burst of fighting when your hands are still shaking and your stomach is a hollow drum. The sugar hits your bloodstream like a flare going up. It's not joy, exactly, but it's energy, and that's what matters. There are tricks to making it more palatable. You can crumble it into your coffee for a bitter mocha. You can melt it into hot milk from a can for something like hot chocolate. Some soldiers even mixed it with crushed biscuits to make a rough chocolate paste. And in rare cases, when supplies from home made it through, you could trade the bar for a real candy bar from the civilian market, if you found someone willing to part with it. For some, the D ration became a small comfort despite its flaws. Holding it in your hand felt like holding a piece of home, Hershey's stamped right there in the metal mold lines. It was proof that someone, somewhere, was thinking about the soldier in the field. Others, less sentimental, saw it as a cruel joke. One Marine in the Pacific famously used his tropical bar as a hammer to fix a tent peg. The British had their own wartime chocolate, Cadbury's emergency rations, high in cocoa and sugar, often fortified with vitamins. While sweeter than the American version, it still wasn't designed to be a treat. The Germans issued chocolate with caffeine added for a stimulant effect. Japanese forces sometimes carried energy sweets, made from compressed sugar and rice flour, though these didn't last as long in the heat. The D ration also found its way into morale stories. There's one about a soldier in Europe who, during a lull in fighting, traded his bar to a French farmer for a wedge of fresh cheese. Another tells of a pilot who always carried one in his flight suit, convinced it was lucky. He never ate it, just kept it as a talisman through dozens of missions. And yet, for all the jokes, there's no denying its utility. This bar, unpleasant as it might be, was a concentrated bundle of survival. It was proof that food didn't have to be good to keep you alive. Soldiers learned to respect it in the way you respect a stubborn mule. It might not be pleasant company, but it will carry you when you need it. When you finish your portion, chewed slowly, swallowed with gulps of water, you notice the aftertaste. It's slightly metallic, slightly bitter, and it lingers far longer than you'd like. You tuck the rest of the bar back into your pack, knowing it might be days before you see another. And in some small way, you feel better just having it there. Not because you want to eat it, but because in a world where so much can go wrong, it's one small thing you can count on to still be there when you need it most. You quickly discover that in the world of rations, taste is negotiable, but trade is an art. The official supply chain might hand you the same tins and packets as the guy next to you, but that doesn't mean you'll end up eating them. Welcome to the informal economy of the front lines, where trading and bartering rations is as common as polishing your boots. It starts small. Maybe you hate the canned cheese spread but love the fruit cocktail. The man across from you has the opposite preference. A quick swap, a satisfied nod, and suddenly breakfast is better for both of you. From there, the deals get bigger and more creative. Some soldiers develop reputations as expert traders, always managing to get more than they give. They're the ones who somehow end up with extra cigarettes, an extra chocolate bar, and the last tin of peaches in camp. You watch these exchanges with interest, noting that the real currency out here isn't money, it's taste, comfort, and rarity. Cigarettes, for example, are practically gold. Even if you don't smoke, you can trade them for almost anything. One cigarette might buy you a cup of real coffee from the mess tent. A whole pack might get you a hot meal from someone who's sick of their assignment in the kitchen. The value isn't fixed, it shifts with mood, weather, and supply drops. In the Pacific, a cigarette could be worth a can of meat. In the freezing Ardennes, it might get you a pair of dry socks. Then there's chocolate, both the bitter D ration kind and the sweeter stuff from care packages. The tropical bar might not be loved, but it's portable, calorie-dense, and still better than nothing. In the right moment, it can buy a small feast. One story tells of a soldier who traded his last chocolate bar for a slice of freshly baked bread from a French farmhouse, and insisted it was the best deal he ever made. You also see the rise of combo trades, where someone puts together a package deal. 3 biscuits, a packet of lemonade powder, and a tin of corned beef might snag you a fresh apple from a local market. A pair of gloves, traded from another deal, can sweeten the bargain even more. Sometimes, bartering crosses national lines. In Italy, American soldiers swap their coffee and cigarettes for wine from British troops. In North Africa, tins of spam pass between Allied units and locals in exchange for flatbread or olives. Historians still argue whether these exchanges improved morale or risked supply discipline, but for the men on the ground, it was survival with a smile. And there's the black market, unofficial but thriving. Supply trucks roll in, and suddenly someone knows a guy who can get you real butter, canned pineapple, or even a bottle of liquor. Payment might be in cigarettes, canned meat, or even services, like mending a torn uniform or fixing a radio. This shadow economy exists in every camp, from the muddy foxholes of France to the sweltering tents of the Pacific. Of course, there are risks. Officers officially disapprove of ration trading, especially across units. If you're caught making a big swap while on duty, you might find yourself peeling potatoes for a week. But enforcement is half-hearted. Most officers know that trading keeps spirits up and bellies full. Some trades are born out of generosity rather than self-interest. You've seen men give away their only chocolate bar to a younger soldier on his first day in the field, or pass their tin of fruit to someone sick in bed. Food is fuel, but it's also connection, and out here, connections matter. There are also cultural quirks. British troops will give up almost anything before they part with their tea. Americans hoard coffee like treasure. Australians, with their tins of jam, become sudden celebrities in camp. Germans guard their sausages jealously, while Italians will trade extra rations for fresh bread at almost any price. You soon develop your own strategy. You keep an eye on the men who always complain about certain foods. They're your easiest trade partners. You learn which items are rare at which times, and you store them until demand peaks. And you never, ever trade away your last pack of cigarettes, even if you don't smoke. In the evenings, after a long day, you see the barter network in action. Soldiers sit on overturned crates, laying out their rations like merchants in a bazaar. There's quiet haggling, whispered offers, and the occasional triumphant laugh when someone pulls off a particularly good deal. By the time you turn in for the night, your kit looks different than it did in the morning. You've got an extra tin of peaches, a pack of gum, and miracle of miracles, a real chocolate bar from home. Tomorrow, it might all be gone again, traded for something else. But for now, you're a little richer than you were, and your next meal is looking much brighter. There comes a point when even the most disciplined supply chain falters. When the trucks are delayed, the skies are too dangerous for airdrops, and the depot is miles behind enemy lines. That's when you learn the quiet art of frontline foraging. Out here, your next meal might come from a hedgerow, a fishing line, or whatever happens to be wandering too close to camp. It starts with curiosity. You're marching through farmland in France, and someone spots an apple tree just off the road. One man keeps watch while another climbs up, filling his pockets. It's not in the rations manual, but the rules bend when hunger sharpens its teeth. Fresh fruit is a rare prize, vitamin-rich and morale-boosting in a way no tin of hash could ever match. Sometimes foraging is sanctioned. Command might tell you to supplement rations with whatever the local countryside provides, especially in places where supply convoys are slow. Other times, it's strictly, don't get caught. Historians still argue whether such practices were harmless necessity or a slippery slope into looting. The reality, as you quickly learn, is that the line between survival and mischief is blurry. You might find yourself scouring the hedgerows for berries, pockets stained purple by the time you're done. In the Pacific, soldiers have been known to crack open coconuts, the sweet water inside tasting like a holiday compared to canteen water. In Italy, figs and grapes become as precious as gold. You eat them fresh, the juice running down your chin, savoring each bite before returning to the metallic tang of ration tins. Protein foraging takes more ingenuity. In rural areas, a lucky squad might buy, or borrow, a chicken from a local farmer. Cooked over a makeshift fire, it's a feast. Fresh fish is another prize, especially if you're near a river or coast. Soldiers fashion hooks from bent wire, string lines from parachute cord, and cook their catch in helmets balanced over coals. There are also the questionable meals. A British unit in North Africa once tried roasting desert lizards. The verdict was, edible, but don't think about it too much. In the jungles of New Guinea, some men boiled taro root without realizing the skin was toxic unless peeled correctly. A few stomachaches later, they learned the lesson. And then there's scavenging from abandoned positions. Moving into a recently evacuated area, you might find half-empty tins, sacks of grain, or a crate of potatoes tucked away in a shed. These finds feel like treasure hunts, except sometimes the treasure turns out to be spoiled, infested, or a little too mysterious to risk. Foraging often becomes a group activity. In quieter moments, men fan out, one watching for enemy movement, while others search for anything edible. There's a quiet satisfaction in coming back to camp with a handful of mushrooms or a bundle of wild greens. Someone will inevitably claim they're poisonous. Someone else will swear they're fine. You eat them anyway, because hunger has its own logic. Even officers aren't immune to the lure of fresh food. One captain in France supposedly ordered a halt to an entire convoy because he saw a local woman pulling fresh bread from her oven. Within an hour, her loaves were gone, traded for canned meat and cigarettes. Both sides left the deal smiling. The flip side of foraging is the risk. Picking fruit in the wrong place might bring you into mine territory. Fishing at night could draw unwanted attention from patrol boats. And in occupied zones, approaching the wrong farmhouse could lead to confrontation, or worse. You learn to read the land, to spot which trees bear fruit, which barns hide supplies, and which doors are better left closed. For all the dangers, foraging feeds something deeper than just the body. It breaks the monotony, reconnects you with the idea of real food, and offers moments of unexpected joy. There's nothing like biting into something fresh after weeks of canned meals. The crunch of an apple, the sweetness of a grape, the smoky flavor of a fish cooked within minutes of catching it. One evening, you sit on a low wall outside a French village, sharing a loaf of bread you helped bake in a borrowed oven. The crust is warm, the air smells faintly of wood smoke, and for a few minutes, you could almost forget there's a war. That's the real magic of frontline foraging. It's not just about filling your stomach, but about reminding yourself you're still human in a place trying very hard to make you forget. Eventually, you learn that your mess kit is more than just a plate, it's a toolbox. And in the absence of a proper kitchen, you start looking at every piece of gear as a potential cooking implement. That's when you discover one of the oldest field cooking tricks in the book, making a meal in your helmet. It sounds ridiculous until you see it in action. In World War II, soldiers learned to use their steel helmets for everything: washing, shaving, boiling water, even baking bread in a pinch. When the supply truck was late or you were too far forward for a field kitchen, the helmet became your frying pan, stockpot, and mixing bowl all in one. The process was simple, if slightly unsettling. First, you'd give the helmet a quick rinse. In theory, this removed the dirt, dust, and lingering smell of yesterday's sweat. In reality, it just made you feel better about what you were about to do. Then you'd fill it with water from a canteen or nearby stream. Boiling was essential for safety, and set it over whatever heat source you could manage: a small campfire, a burner from a field stove, or even the engine block of a truck idling nearby. Soup was the most common helmet recipe. Throw in chopped up rations, meat hash, biscuits crumbled into chunks, maybe a handful of foraged greens, and let it all simmer until it resembled something edible. If you had a few spices from a care package, or just some salt from another ration pack, you could almost trick yourself into thinking it was homemade stew. Frying was trickier. You had to hold the helmet just right over the flames so it didn't tip, and you had to keep stirring so nothing burned. Powdered eggs, rehydrated with water or milk, were a favorite candidate. Sometimes they stuck to the bottom, leaving a crust that had to be scraped out with a knife, but other times, with enough grease from tinned bacon or spam, they cooked into something fluffy and golden. Baking bread was more of a stunt than a necessity, but it happened. Soldiers would make dough from flour, water, and a little yeast, then pack it into the inverted helmet and set it near, not over, the fire. Slowly, the heat would rise through the metal, turning the dough into a crude loaf. It was dense, a little metallic in taste, but better than nothing. Of course, there were less than successful experiments. One unlucky soldier tried making coffee in his helmet, and forgot to rinse out the soap he'd used earlier to clean it. Another tried deep-frying potato slices in tinned meat fat, only to set the edges of his helmet liner smoldering. Helmets were tough, but they weren't indestructible. The practice wasn't limited to Americans. British troops used their Brodie helmets for much the same purpose, often to brew tea when kettles were scarce. Australians in New Guinea swore by helmet stews thickened with whatever root vegetables they could find. Even German soldiers sometimes boiled potatoes in their Stahlhelm when the field kitchens were days away. Historians still argue whether cooking in helmets was officially discouraged or simply ignored. Technically, your helmet was part of your protective gear, and damaging it could be a serious risk. But when you were cold, wet, and hungry, rules tended to bend. The priority was keeping your strength up, even if it meant your headgear smelled faintly of onions for the rest of the week. Beyond practicality, there was camaraderie in helmet cooking. You'd see small groups huddled around a single pot, each tossing in what they could spare. One guy might contribute a can of meat, another a handful of dried peas, another a pinch of salt. When the stew was ready, everyone dipped in, the helmet passing from hand to hand, steaming in the cool air. Sometimes, the improvisation went beyond the helmet. Bayonets doubled as skewers for roasting meat over a fire. Rifle barrels, after being fired enough to heat up, were wrapped in foil and used to warm bread or heat beans. Mess tins became ovens, and ammunition crates were converted into makeshift tables. The battlefield had no shortage of creativity, especially when the alternative was another cold tin of hash. By the time you've tried helmet cooking yourself, you start to appreciate the ingenuity behind it. The food might not win awards, but it's hot, filling, and yours. There's a certain satisfaction in looking down into that battered steel bowl and knowing you made something out of nothing. And when you put it back on your head later, still faintly warm from the fire, you can't help but smile at the absurdity of it all. Every now and then, the war pauses just enough to remind you that you're still human. It might be a cold December morning in Belgium, or a damp November evening in Italy, but word spreads through the camp faster than any order. Holiday rations are in. You can feel the shift in mood immediately. Men who were grumbling about the weather an hour ago are now smiling, speculating about what might be inside the crates. Holiday feasts at war were a logistical miracle. They weren't guaranteed, and they didn't always arrive on the exact day of the holiday. Sometimes Christmas dinner happened in January, sometimes Thanksgiving showed up in March, but when they came, they were an event. The quartermasters and cooks worked overtime to make it happen, knowing full well how much morale depended on it. You've been eating tins of hash and powdered eggs for weeks when suddenly you're staring at things you haven't seen since you left home: roast turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, maybe even real pie. In the European theater, American troops sometimes got whole roasted birds, shipped frozen from the States and cooked in massive field ovens. British soldiers could expect roast beef or lamb with potatoes, plus pudding or fruitcake. The Canadians liked to add canned peas and carrots for a splash of color, and the Australians, ever practical, would make sure there was plenty of tea alongside whatever main course they could manage. One of the most treasured holiday extras was fresh bread. Not the dense, dark loaves that occasionally came in rations, but soft, fluffy bread baked in the field kitchens that morning. Paired with real butter, another rarity, it was almost enough to make a man tear up. Historians still argue whether the bread itself was that good or if it was simply the contrast to the usual fare that made it unforgettable. And then there were the sweets. Chocolate bars, candies, and cookies arrived in care packages from home, or were distributed by organizations like the Red Cross or the YMCA. Even if you weren't much for sweets before the war, you learned to appreciate the way sugar could light up a gray day. Some men would save their holiday chocolate for weeks, tucking it away like a secret treasure to be enjoyed on a bad day. Alcohol, though officially restricted in many places, often made an appearance. A bottle of wine from a nearby village, a few cans of beer smuggled in with the supply crates, or even homemade spirits shared by locals could turn a quiet celebration into a noisy, laughing affair. You'd see men toasting each other with tin cups, the firelight flickering off tired faces that, for once, were relaxed. The decorations were as improvised as the menu. In snowy regions, men cut small pine trees and decorated them with whatever they could find: strips of ration tins, bits of colored paper from cigarette packs, even cartridge cases polished until they shone. In the tropics, palm fronds might stand in for evergreens, with bright flowers tucked in for color. Someone always tried to carve something festive from whatever food was available: a turnip snowman, a pineapple centerpiece, a loaf of bread shaped like a wreath. These feasts were more than just meals. They were moments of connection. Men would gather around long makeshift tables, sometimes just planks laid across barrels, and share stories from home. For a few hours, the war receded to the background, replaced by laughter, friendly teasing, and the clatter of cutlery on tin plates. Not every holiday meal was perfect, of course. Sometimes the turkey was dry, the potatoes were lumpy, and the cranberry sauce was just red gelatin with ambition. Sometimes the pie was more crust than filling, and the gravy had a suspiciously powdered taste. But none of that mattered. The effort itself was the gift. You remember one Christmas Eve in France when the supply convoy was delayed, and the cooks had almost nothing to work with. They raided the remaining rations, combined tinned beef with dried onions, mashed powdered potatoes, and baked what they called field shepherd's pie. For dessert, they mixed canned milk with cocoa powder and sugar to make a kind of chocolate pudding. It wasn't home, but it was warm, and everyone went to bed that night with full bellies and a little more hope. The memory of those meals stuck. Years later, veterans would talk about them as some of their fondest wartime moments, not because the food was the best they'd ever had, but because it reminded them of who they were fighting for and what they hoped to return to. Out there in the mud and cold, a shared meal on a holiday was proof that you could still carve out a piece of normal life, even in the middle of chaos. When the feast was over, you'd lick the last gravy from your fork, lean back on your crate or stool, and listen to the quiet hum of contentment in the air. Tomorrow, the war would start again. But tonight you'd sleep with the taste of home on your tongue. You eventually realize that no matter how efficient the military ration system is, nothing compares to fresh, local cooking, especially when you've been eating out of tins for months. The first time you get a taste of local cuisine, it's almost overwhelming, like suddenly remembering a song you hadn't heard since childhood. It usually happens when your unit is stationed near a village or small town. Maybe you're on rest and refit duty, maybe you're waiting for the weather to clear, or maybe you're just passing through on a supply run. One way or another, you find yourself close enough to civilian life to smell real cooking. Bread baking in a stone oven. Meat sizzling over open flames. Spices drifting on the air, sharp, warm, and utterly absent from any ration pack you've ever opened. At first, you approach cautiously. There's always the question of safety. Is the food clean? Will it agree with your stomach after months of processed meals? Historians still argue whether eating local during World War II was a calculated risk or a reckless indulgence, but for soldiers, it was often worth finding out. In France, it might be a hunk of crusty bread with soft cheese, or a bowl of stew rich with herbs and fresh vegetables. In Italy, a plate of pasta tossed with olive oil and garlic could make a man swear he just tasted heaven. In the Pacific, locals might offer fresh tropical fruit, bananas, mangoes, papayas, so bright and sweet they almost shock your tongue. Sometimes these meals are bought with coins, sometimes with barter, cigarettes, canned meat, or chocolate in exchange for a seat at a table. Other times, they're offered freely, as gestures of hospitality or gratitude. You remember one old woman in Belgium who brought out a tray of fresh waffles to a squad standing watch near her farm. She didn't speak a word of English, but her smile needed no translation. And it's not just about the taste, it's about the ritual. Sitting down at a real table instead of a log. Eating from ceramic plates instead of dented tin. Using a fork that isn't stamped U.S. Army on the handle. Even the sound is different. The clink of cutlery, the low murmur of conversation, the crackle of a fire that's there purely for warmth, not just cooking. There are surprises, too, things that challenge your palate. In parts of Asia, you might be offered fermented fish or sticky rice wrapped in leaves. In North Africa, couscous with lamb might be seasoned with spices you can't name but will never forget. In Eastern Europe, you could find yourself sipping borscht so tangy and rich that you can't believe it's made from humble beets. Not every encounter goes smoothly. A few men overdo it, and spend the next day regretting it. One squad in Italy once mistook strong homemade grappa for water and learned the hard way that it's not a lunchtime drink. Another group tried a local delicacy of pickled herring and cream, only to decide it was better suited to fishing bait than human consumption. But even the less pleasant meals have their place in the memory. They become part of the war stories you'll tell later. The day you ate something you couldn't pronounce, the time you burned your mouth on soup because you were too eager, the afternoon you traded your last tin of peaches for a slice of bread so fresh the steam was still rising from it. There's also a quiet diplomacy in these moments. Sharing a meal breaks down barriers, if only for an hour. You learn a few words of the local language, enough to say thank you, enough to laugh at a joke. They learn that soldiers, even in uniform, still crave good food and kindness. One evening, after weeks of nothing but rations, you sit at a farmhouse table in the French countryside. The air is warm from the hearth, and the table is crowded with bowls of roasted potatoes, platters of chicken, baskets of bread. You eat until you can't move, then lean back in your chair, watching the light from the fire flicker across the faces around you. For a moment, the war feels very far away. When you leave, you tuck a small wedge of cheese into your pocket, not because you're still hungry, but because you know tomorrow you'll be back to tins and powder. And when you take that cheese out the next day, sitting in the mud with the wind in your face, you'll remember the farmhouse, the bread, and the warmth, and it will make the rations go down just a little easier. The first time you step into a Navy galley, you realize the smell is completely different from anything on land. It's a mix of coffee so strong it could wake the dead, frying oil that seeped into every surface, and the faint, ever-present tang of salt water. The galley is the heart of shipboard life, not glamorous, not spacious, but absolutely essential to keeping the crew upright and functioning. Ship kitchens have a rhythm all their own. Space is tight, equipment is bolted down, and the cooks work in a constant state of organized chaos. They're juggling dozens of tasks at once, timing meals to the ship's schedule and the unpredictable demands of the sea. In heavy weather, you might see them wedging themselves between counters, cooking while the floor tilts under their feet. More than one pot of stew has gone sliding across the galley in a sudden swell. On larger vessels, battleships, aircraft carriers, the menu can be surprisingly varied. You might get fresh bread baked daily, eggs cooked to order, and even ice cream if the refrigeration is holding up. These ships have enough storage and refrigeration to carry perishable goods for weeks, so you might get actual lettuce in your salad, or fresh fruit instead of the canned variety. It feels almost decadent compared to the field rations you've known. But smaller ships, like destroyers or submarines, are another story. On a sub, space is so limited that food storage often means stuffing supplies into every possible nook. Fresh produce disappears in the first few days of a voyage. After that, it's canned goods, powdered milk, and whatever can be cooked in a space barely larger than a closet. Historians still argue whether submarine cooks had the hardest job in the Navy or just the most creative. Coffee is the one constant. Navy coffee is infamous, black, bitter, and served around the clock. On some ships, it's so strong you could practically stand a spoon in it. The saying goes that sailors don't drink coffee for the taste. They drink it because it keeps them moving through the long, strange hours at sea. Mealtimes on a ship are less about savoring and more about keeping the schedule tight. You queue up in the mess line, tray in hand, sliding past the steam tables where the cooks slap down portions with mechanical efficiency. On a calm day, you can sit and eat without trouble. On a rough one, you might have to hold your tray with one hand and your cup with the other to keep them from sliding away. The menu rotates, but certain dishes are universal: navy bean soup, corned beef hash, fried fish on Fridays. Pancakes or French toast appear now and then, often drowned in syrup that's more sugar than maple. And then there's SOS. Stuff on a shingle. Cream-chipped beef on toast, beloved by some, hated by others, and remembered by everyone. Special occasions at sea bring their own twists. Holiday meals might mean roast turkey and stuffing, with the tables decorated as best they can be in the middle of the ocean. A crossing the equator ceremony might be followed by a meal of something wildly improvised, just for the fun of it. Once in a while, a port call allows the crew to bring back fresh goods from shore, vegetables, fruit, or even local seafood. Navy food has its quirks. Bread might be warm and fresh one day, then replaced by ship-baked hard rolls the next. Eggs can be fresh, frozen, or powdered, depending on how long you've been at sea. Milk might come from a carton one week, powdered packets the next. And every sailor has a theory about which dishes mean the ship's stores are running low. Mystery stew and peanut butter sandwiches are common suspects. But despite the limitations, shipboard meals become a cornerstone of morale. Sitting in the mess hall, packed elbow to elbow with your shipmates, you swap stories, tease each other, and share whatever small luxuries turn up. Someone might slide you an extra biscuit, or pass over the slice of pie they don't want. Food isn't just fuel, it's the daily punctuation mark in the endless sentence of ship life. One evening, the sea is calm, the sunset is a blaze of orange on the horizon, and the galley serves fried fish with lemon wedges. You sit with your back against the bulkhead, tray balanced on your knees, and savor the rare combination of good weather, decent food, and a quiet moment. The smell of salt air mixes with the steam from your coffee, and for a little while, the war feels very far away. And when the duty bell rings, you stand, scrape your tray, and head back to work, knowing the galley will still be there on your next break, ladling out something hot to keep you going through the endless ocean night. The air inside a bomber or transport plane is thin, dry, and loud. Engines roar so constantly that conversation turns into a series of shouts and nods. Somewhere in that noise, you open your meal tin, trying to eat while strapped into a seat at thousands of feet above the ground. Welcome to the peculiar world of Air Force rations, food designed not just to survive the journey, but to be eaten in an environment where your taste buds don't quite work the way they should. It's a strange fact, but at altitude, your sense of taste dulls. The lower pressure, dry cabin environment, and constant vibration change how food hits your tongue. Sweet and salty flavors weaken, while bitter notes come forward. Historians still argue whether the Air Force truly accounted for this in World War II ration design, or if crews simply learned to tolerate blander food. Either way, you quickly realize why so many aerial meals are loaded with extra salt and sugar. In long-range bombers like the B-17 or B-24, crews didn't have space for elaborate meals. Instead, they carried boxed or canned rations, often a mix of K-rations and specially packaged combat lunch kits. These might contain biscuits, canned meat, chocolate, and a packet of powdered drink mix. If you were lucky, there might be a small thermos of coffee or tea, prepared before takeoff. Warming food was a luxury. In some planes, you could rest the can on part of the engine casing to heat it slightly, but more often, you ate it cold. Frozen fingers made opening tins a challenge, so the P-38 can opener was as essential in the air as it was on the ground. The smell of canned meat in a closed cabin was memorable, and it tended to linger for the rest of the flight. Fighter pilots had it even rougher. No galley, no storage, just whatever they could carry in a pocket or flight bag. Some stashed chocolate bars or gum, not for meals but to keep their mouths from drying out during long missions. Others brought a single sandwich wrapped in wax paper, eating it in hurried bites between patrol sweeps. There were moments of innovation, too. In transport planes carrying cargo over long distances, crews sometimes packed fresh bread, fruit, or hard-boiled eggs in insulated boxes. These small luxuries were rationed carefully, sometimes saved for the halfway point of the journey as a morale boost. Then there were the British Royal Air Force rations, which sometimes included boiled sweets, tins of condensed milk, and small fruitcakes, a nod to the belief that sugar and tea could cure almost anything. American crews often traded for these, especially the fruitcakes, which had a surprisingly long shelf life and could withstand the bumps and jolts of rough flights. Eating in the air wasn't always pleasant. Turbulence could turn a simple spoonful of beans into a disaster on your flight jacket. Drinks were tricky, open cups were a hazard, so most beverages came in sealed bottles or flasks. One crewman on a long Pacific hop swore off coffee for life after a particularly bad spill left him wearing it for 8 hours straight. Still, mealtime in the air had its own rituals. The navigator might pass out ration boxes, the bombardier might cut open tins for the gunners, and the pilot might joke about fine dining at 10,000 feet. Sharing food helped break up the monotony of endless hours over ocean or farmland. Sometimes, the real treat was what came after the flight. Returning to base, you'd swap stories with ground crews and sometimes trade leftover flight rations for something warm from the mess hall. The idea of eating fresh eggs or a steaming bowl of soup after a long mission made even the coldest, driest canned meal worth getting through. One night flight stands out in your memory. You're crossing dark waters under a cloudless sky, stars so sharp they look close enough to touch. You open a can of fruit cocktail. It's cold from the altitude, the syrup thick and sweet, and for a moment you could almost be anywhere but here. You eat slowly, trying to make it last, because you know the mission isn't over, and the comfort of food is one of the few things you can control up here. When the wheels finally touch down hours later, you're stiff, tired, and more than ready for something hot. But you tuck the empty fruit tin into your kit anyway, a reminder that even at altitude, in the middle of war, there were moments of small, stubborn pleasure. Sooner or later, every soldier meets the medical ward, not always from wounds, but from the quiet enemies of war, infection, exhaustion, or a gut that finally decides to revolt after too many tins of hash. When you end up here, food changes again. The battlefield menu is set aside, replaced by the soft diet, a collection of bland, gentle meals designed to coax your body back into working order. The first thing you notice is how quiet it is compared to the rest of camp. Instead of the clang of mess trays or the thump of boots, there's the low murmur of nurses and the occasional rattle of a medicine cart. And then there's the smell, less of grease and coffee, more of disinfectant and boiled something. Your first meal in the ward might be broth, clear, hot, and tasting mostly of salt. It's easy on the stomach, but not exactly thrilling. Still, after a few days of nausea or fever, that first spoonful feels like an anchor. Historians still argue whether wartime military diets for the sick were truly restorative or simply the easiest to prepare in bulk, but the effect is undeniable. They make you slow down. Breakfast might be cream of wheat or oatmeal, both cooked soft enough that they barely need chewing. If milk is available, it's added in generous amounts, along with a spoonful of sugar. Toast appears often, cut into manageable slices and sometimes softened with butter or jam if you're lucky. Eggs, when they come, are boiled or poached, nothing fried or spicy. Lunch and dinner lean heavily on mashed potatoes, boiled vegetables, and simple proteins like poached chicken or baked fish. In British wards, there might be shepherd's pie with more mash than meat. In American ones, meatloaf might make an appearance, but without the usual seasoning. The idea is to spare your digestive system any surprises. Dessert exists here, but it's mild: pudding, gelatin, stewed fruit. Gelatin is especially popular. It's easy to swallow, hydrating, and requires no chewing. Some soldiers start to hate the wobble of it after a few days. Others come to see it as a small, sweet break in an otherwise monotonous diet. Tea is common, especially in British and Commonwealth wards, served with milk and sugar. In American units, you might get weak coffee or cocoa if your stomach can handle it. And then there's water, plain, tepid, and given constantly. Hydration is as much a part of recovery as any medicine. The medical diet isn't just about physical healing, it's about routine. Mealtimes are fixed, and someone always checks to make sure you've eaten enough. The nurses encourage you to take small bites, to chew slowly, to rest afterward. It's the opposite of the rush and grab of the front lines. For a few days, you're not gulping food in a trench or balancing a mess tin on your knees. You're sitting, eating slowly, letting your body remember what it feels like not to be in motion. There's also a kind of quiet camaraderie here. Everyone at your table is mending, someone with a bandaged arm, someone recovering from pneumonia, someone with a cough that just won't go away. You swap small talk, complain about the food without much conviction, and sometimes share bits of contraband, a piece of chocolate from a visiting comrade, a slice of bread from the main mess. One day, you get a surprise. A visitor brings in fresh fruit. Apples slightly bruised from the journey, but still crisp. Oranges, their scent sharp and bright against the hospital smell. You eat slowly, savoring every bite, and for a moment the bland broths and mashed vegetables fade from memory. Sometimes, the medical diet even sparks creativity. Soldiers trade tips on how to make it more interesting, sprinkling sugar on porridge, mashing vegetables into potatoes, crumbling a biscuit into soup for texture. None of it would impress a chef, but it passes the time and gives you a small sense of control. By the time you're cleared to return to duty, you feel stronger but also oddly reluctant to leave the quiet. You've gotten used to warm meals served at tables, to the absence of mud and rain at mealtime. The final plate might be a bowl of soft rice pudding or a slice of buttered toast, and you eat it slowly, knowing the next thing you taste will probably be tinned meat or powdered eggs again. As you walk out of the ward, someone calls after you to take it easy, to eat carefully for the next few days. You nod, but you already know that the moment you're back in the field, careful eating won't be an option. Still, you tuck away the memory of those quiet, bland meals, the strange comfort they brought in a place where comfort was hard to find. The war doesn't end with a sudden silence. It fades, slowly, unevenly, until one day you're no longer waking up to the sound of orders and boots, but to the creak of a familiar bed in a place that actually smells like home. And just like that, the military menu that's defined your life for years is gone, replaced by civilian food, real food, that doesn't come in a tin or a powdered packet. The first meals after discharge are almost surreal. Fresh eggs cracked into a frying pan, the yolks sunny and intact instead of reconstituted from powder. Bread still warm from a local bakery. Coffee brewed from freshly ground beans that fill the kitchen with a scent so rich you can almost taste it before you take a sip. You find yourself staring at your plate longer than you eat, half expecting someone to shout that breakfast is over and you need to move out. At first, it's bliss. Every bite is full of flavor you didn't realize you'd forgotten. Meat that tastes like meat, vegetables with color and crunch, fruit that drips juice down your chin. There's no rush to finish, no need to guard your plate from the man next to you, no faint metallic taste from a can. You eat slowly, almost reverently. But then something unexpected happens. After a few weeks, you find yourself missing some of the old rations, not because they were good, but because they were familiar. You remember the solid heft of AD ration bar in your pocket, the barter games over canned peaches, the smell of coffee brewed in a helmet over a small fire. Food in the military wasn't just fuel. It was a rhythm, a shared language, and even the blandest meal came with the company of people who understood exactly what you were going through. Historians still argue about the psychological side of this nostalgia, whether it's about the food itself or the memories attached to it. You suspect it's both. A can of corned beef hash in a grocery store might not taste the same as it did in a muddy foxhole, but holding it in your hands brings back the laughter, the grumbling, the shared silence of a meal eaten in the rain. You also notice that civilian abundance can be overwhelming. In the service, you didn't have to decide what to eat, your choice was whatever was in the tin. Now you walk into a diner and stare at a menu with 50 options, each one a small miracle. It's liberating, but it also makes you realize how much mental space you used to save by not having to choose. Sometimes you recreate old meals just to see if they were really as bad, or as good, as you remember. You scramble powdered eggs for your nephew, who takes one bite and looks at you like you've committed a crime. You open a tin of peaches, pour the syrup into a glass, and find that it still tastes like a little piece of sunshine. You make coffee strong enough to strip paint and drink it black, smiling at the memory of the mess hall. And there's a quiet gratitude that creeps in. You know now how precious fresh bread is, how rare it is to sit down to a hot meal without worrying about the weather, the terrain, or the next set of orders. You savor each meal in a way you never did before the war, not just because it tastes better, but because it's yours, chosen and cooked without ration stamps or military supply codes. One evening, months after returning home, you find yourself sitting on the back porch with a simple dinner, a slice of roast beef, potatoes, green beans, and a piece of pie. The sun is setting, the air is warm, and somewhere in the distance, a radio plays a song you haven't heard since before you shipped out. You take a bite of pie, and it's perfect, not because it's the best pie in the world, but because you're here, in this moment, free to finish it at your own pace. And maybe that's the real end of the ration story, not when the tins are gone, but when you can finally choose what's on your plate, knowing you've earned the right to never again eat hash out of a helmet unless you want to. Now that the story has run its course, let's slow everything down. The noise of the barracks, the rattle of mess trays, the endless crinkle of ration wrappers, fade them out until they're nothing more than faint echoes. Picture instead a quiet kitchen, lit only by the golden glow of a lamp. There's a plate in front of you, warm to the touch, and the scent of something freshly baked drifting through the air. The chair beneath you is sturdy, the table smooth beneath your hands. There's no rush to eat, no one hurrying you along. Outside, the world is still, the sky painted in soft blues and purples. You can hear the faint hum of an old refrigerator, the gentle clink of cutlery against a plate. You take a slow bite. Whatever's on the fork is soft and flavorful, familiar in the best way. You chew without thinking about calories or rations or supply lines. You sip from a mug, feeling the warmth move down your throat and into your chest. Each swallow carries with it the knowledge that there's more if you want it, that scarcity is no longer part of the bargain. Somewhere far away, the memory of wartime meals drifts into the background. The powdered eggs, the bitter coffee, the dense chocolate that never melted, they're still part of your story, but now they're just that, memories. Here and now, in this quiet, there's only comfort. You set down your fork, lean back slightly, and let your eyes close. The air is warm, your stomach is full, and your heartbeat is steady. Whatever came before, whatever waits tomorrow, tonight belongs entirely to rest. The kitchen light hums softly above you, and the world exhales with you. Sweet dreams.